am the Capacity Building Program Manager for Human Rights Education here at RFK Center for Human Rights. And we're so excited to help bring a powerful new documentary, In Her Hands, to your classroom in partnership with Netflix. Filmed across 2 turbulent years, In Her Hands tells the story of Zarifa Ghaffari, who at 26 became one of Afghanistan's first female mayors and the youngest to ever hold the position. The film documents her fight for survival against the backdrop of her country's accelerated unraveling. If you haven't had the chance yet to watch the film, you can view it on Netflix, and then you can go to our website to find out some more background information, some introduction to Zarifa Ghaffari and to Afghanistan, and a pre-recorded panel discussion with the directors of the film. We're here today with Kristi Ueda, who is a California barred attorney and current Wilson Fellow with the International Advocacy and Litigation team at RFK Human Rights. And she works on civic space, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and other related human rights issues in Africa and Asia. Welcome, Kristi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited. So we'll just kind of get started with a question that can help us situate some human and get some basic knowledge of human rights issues in the region, and then we'll go from there and open it up to other questions. So because of the historic human rights issues in Afghanistan, it just seemed really incredible to me watching the film that Zarifa was elected mayor of Afghanistan at all. And while she faced some really significant challenges, some of them resulting from the fact that she is a woman, while she was in office, the real danger came when Kabul fell and she had to flee for her safety. Could you walk us through some of the issues that women are facing now in Afghanistan or in that region?
Yes, definitely. And unfortunately, I think one of the defining features, as we've seen from the documentary, is that these are not new issues necessarily that women are facing currently. Zarifa herself, while she was mayor and as she was even running for mayor, these are kind of the same sentiments that were thrown her way. It's just the different degree to which they have restricted rights. That's the new part. And so, unfortunately, I don't think it's necessarily the biggest shift in women's rights and opinions on the stereotyped roles of women that has changed in recent years. And so as we've seen, restricting women's rights is a top priority for the Taliban. That's kind of the whole thing that we've seen when they were in power before. And this time when Kabul fell, there were initial promises to uphold human rights and particularly women's rights. But as we've seen, slowly, but also with tremendous speed, access and opportunities have been taken away one by one. And so whether it's closing civic space completely, restricting freedom of movement, restricting free speech, not allowing women to be out without a covering and without a male chaperone. There are just so many different rules that have been implemented along the way. But I think 2 issues that I really want to highlight and kind of focus on are education and access to public life, because I think those are 2 defining features of Zarifa and what she stands for, and what we've kind of witnessed the gradual, current collapse of through the documentary and through her story. And so I just wanted to start with the legal obligation side of things. So Afghanistan, they, did sign and ratify a lot of different human rights treaties that obligate them to act a certain way, as well as uphold a lot of different rights. And so 2 of the treaties that they did ratify, I just wanted to highlight some relevant articles first, just to kind of give a background of their obligations even now. And so one of them is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW. And Afghanistan signed it in 1980 and ratified it in 2003. And just to note that this treaty, it was entered into force in 1981. And so gender is described in the binary. And so the articles that I'm just going to kind of talk about do have just a binary in terms of gender and sex. And so I just wanted to put that disclaimer out. And so CEDAW Article 5, for example, I think is kind of a huge one that is especially pertinent to the situation in Afghanistan, because a lot of the restrictions on women and women's bodies and women's rights come from this kind of cultural idea, according to the Taliban. But Article 5 actually states that state parties are obliged to work towards modifying social and cultural patterns of individual conduct to eliminate prejudices and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority of any sex or on stereotyped roles. And so culture is never an excuse to subjugate someone based off their gender, and culture is never an excuse to rely on stereotypes to govern policy and law. And another one, CEDAW Article 15, asserts the full equality of women with men before the law. And so what that means, it really demands that all laws, policies, instruments, anything with legal effect directed at restricting women's legal capacity is essentially null and void. And so technically, all these policies and laws and everything that they are passing, because it is directed at restricting women's rights, these technically, if they did oblige by their human rights obligations, they are completely unenforceable. And this article, interestingly enough, it specifically talks about freedom of movement being accorded to all persons equally, which is kind of an interesting part about this Article 15. And just to lay the framework also on the education side of things, CEDAW Article 10, it talks about state parties, they must take measures to ensure equal rights with men in education. And this has extensive details on what that means in terms of equality with men in education. And so, in the documentary, we saw that Zarifa was visiting a school that was recently attacked, and we saw the different qualities of schools, the different school supplies and the different classroom settings and things. But this Article 10 of CEDAW actually requires access to not only the same curriculum and exams, but also teaching staff with the same standards, school premises with the same standards, equipment of the same quality, and just all these different types of facets of education, which we saw even before Kabul fell, were not necessarily being upheld. And also just want to point out that this article in CEDAW, Article 10, also requires the elimination of any education based off stereotyped concept of the roles of men and women. And we saw, in the documentary, we saw just kind of the differences and kind of the stereotyped roles that the women had to do certain things and study certain things and recite certain things, whereas the men were being taught kind of a whole different range of things. And not only that, not only CEDAW, but interestingly enough, Afghanistan has also signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is another international treaty. They signed it in 1990 and they ratified it in 1994. And a huge part of the convention is right to education on the basis of equal opportunity. And so Article 28, for example, it requires that state parties make education accessible, and they encourage regular attendance as well as promote and encourage international cooperation in matters related to education. And the interesting part about this article is it actually has a goal in mind. And so the goal is to contribute to the elimination of ignorance and illiteracy throughout the world. And I think, Zarifa was really doing her part in that. She had so many amazing things that she said during the documentary of how important education is and how, if I think she said something like, if you educate one woman, you save 10 generations. And so she really embraced the purpose of this article in particular. And yeah, just this entire treaty also has so many ideals that I think Zarifa stands for. And so it was very lovely actually to see her just naturally kind of do her part to make sure Afghanistan was upholding their obligations under this treaty. But yeah, so that's the legal basis of everything. And just kind of to talk about, more of like the systemic exclusion of women and girls from public life. I think it's not an it's not an overstatement to say that this exclusion is not only oppressive, but it's actually a form of violence itself. I think we've seen that through Zarifa's life, all the threats against her life, the assassination attempts and everything, exposing women to kind of abuse and that type of discrimination, that level of hostility without any real recourse because there is no equality under the law. It just makes them susceptible to violence. It really prevents them from participating in life and participating in education, which is a key to get them out and to get them aware of what else is out there. And I think, unfortunately, because the threat is so high, as we've seen a lot of, Zarifa herself had to go through a lot of hoops to continue her education. She talked about walking an hour each way to school to complete her bachelor's and master's. And along the way, she was threatened and attacked, regularly. And so I think that that's kind of it just shows like how powerful education is. And I think she recognized that, which I really appreciated. And it was really admirable to witness her like determination to be educated because she knew it would unlock so much more for her. And we witnessed, the fruits of her labor. And I just loved that part. But before I go a little more off topic, just to talk a little bit more also too about, I think, you had mentioned, the idea of her leaving and what that means. And, I think one thing is obviously there were threats to her life and everything, but one thing to keep in mind is the importance of civic space. And so, civic space is closed in Afghanistan. Civic space, for those who aren't familiar, it's essentially the main rights that are relevant to civic space are free speech, free association, and peaceful assembly. And one important thing about being able to be outside of the country is for her to continue to exercise her freedom of expression, and for her to continue her fight and her service to her country. And so I think, even though obviously we saw that it was such a difficult decision for her to leave, for her to continue utilizing her rights and for her to continue her fight, it was necessary for her to leave. And so just even seeing that battle of, what it means to still be in love with your country and wanting to serve it, but knowing that you have to leave. I think that was a really interesting aspect that a lot of people from Afghanistan have had to deal with, especially in recent years. And, there's so many great advocates and human rights defenders who are still working on issues in their country, but from abroad. And so, I think that was a lovely aspect of it all. But yeah, I think I'll stop there for a bit. I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Still really working hard to defend and uphold human rights, but for personal safety has to leave. And I love that how you said, I'm in love with my country. She's in love with her country, but she just can't live there right now. And it's very poignant. And I think it speaks to the next question I want to ask you. So you've mentioned a lot of these international laws, which obviously were ratified, prior to the fall of Kabul. How do you put pressure on a government like this? Kind of what can you do? What's being done? Whether that's Zarifa, someone who's from the country but having to work outside of it, or somebody like, from our teams who are working on international advocacy and litigation. What can you do?
Yeah, that's a really great question and something we definitely ask ourselves every single day in all of the portfolios that we work on. And, unfortunately, there's no, one way to tell a government how to behave, tell a state how to act. But what a lot of it is just awareness, first off. I think being in the public spotlight and having documentaries such as this to show the realities of what is happening, I think that's a really powerful first step, first of all. I think a lot of very oppressive governments, they don't really want the world to know what is exactly happening, which is why they close civic space, they close media outlets, they prevent journalists from doing their important work. And so definitely, I think, just awareness spreading, sharing knowledge about what is going on is just so important. And using that knowledge is the next step in terms of advocacy. And so, there's a lot of different ways and methods and approaches to advocacy. One of the most common is naming and shaming. Governments don't like to be shamed, especially if they do want something. And so I think one important step is figuring out, what does the Taliban want? And one thing is they do want international legitimacy and recognition as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And so with that, I think it's a lot of balancing of how much do they want this? What are they willing to concede to get this? And that, obviously takes a lot of strategy and negotiation. And it's a very delicate balance, which, all negotiations, no one's going to leave completely happy, but we can at least, prioritize like our top 3, top 5 asks kind of, and see if there is a compromise or there is like a gradual progressive way to get to those goals. And not only that too, but I think one hugely important part is trade. Unfortunately, finance and things like that make the world go round, as we know. And so, especially as the Taliban is being, restricted from accessing certain trade opportunities, accessing different sources of making money and things of that nature, I think that's a huge opportunity to kind of condition certain trade and condition certain agreements with human rights provisions. I think that is one way that we've successfully kind of pushed for human rights compliance. And so it's all a work in progress. It's all a case by case basis, but those are kind of the main ways that have traditionally worked. That being said, it's a very slow process. I think, human rights is a very delicate thing. And I think it is, obviously very much worth the effort and everything. But what that means is it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience and strategy. And so hopefully slowly we'll be able to see an improvement gradually.
Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask for Kristi here?
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you once again for sharing so much with us and really pointing out education. But there was a question that I had, kind of going back to, ideals in Afghanistan around, the traditional woman and both the modern woman. Because I saw a lot of notes of, things were very, very traditional, but things were very modern. So, how could that exist in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, where we see, one thing, but the people living there feel something completely different?
Yeah, I attribute a lot of modernity within traditional cultural areas with kind of access to information that is pretty new, in this tech age, with access to the internet and being more interconnected than ever around the globe. I think a lot of it has to do with just information sharing and just being aware of what is out there, different opportunities out there. And I think, once areas are fully exposed to different ways of life that resonate strongly with people, I think, there's no way to really completely quash progress, in my opinion. I think so slowly, I think they've had to kind of adjust what it means to be this traditional woman in their eyes. And I think it was just kind of a natural progression of the world, even here in the United States, women's rights has made so many gains very recently, if you look at the timeline of things. And I think what the Taliban is trying so hard to do, in really going back to the ultimate traditionalist way that they want to live, I think, they really recognize that it is unnatural, especially at this point in the timeline of history. And it always brings me back to this idea of, if women were naturally in like the natural order of things supposed to be the weaker sex, then why do they have to try so hard to force women to be submissive and inferior? If that was just a natural order of things, then that would be the way it is. But clearly they've had to enforce laws, policies, and really horrendous measures to make it so. And so I just think, this is a reaction to the world opening up. This is a reaction to feeling like they are being threatened. And, it goes also back to that common saying of when you're accustomed to privilege, then equality can feel like oppression. And I think that's really what we're witnessing right now. The Taliban felt, they were always dominant. The men were always in control and in power. And even in Zarifa's life, she had men who were very supportive, but she also had traditional men such as her father, who she had to convince him that she was human. And so there's just all these different forces in play that have to do with exposure to different ways of life, as well as the new generation coming up with their own ideals and really recognizing their worth right now. So yeah, a lot of different dynamics at play.
By maybe sharing your favorite part of the film. What really stuck out to you?
Yeah, the entire documentary had me in tears. I thought it was just absolutely beautiful. But one thing that I really, really appreciated about the documentary is, and about Zarifa in general, is she never shied away from embracing her femininity. I think obviously there's no one right way to be a woman, but she never felt the need to present more traditionally masculine to gain respect and to be her role as a mayor. And so seeing her with her stuffed animals, seeing her just being so in love with her husband, seeing her bicker with her sisters and her mom, and just feeling so much like a relatable woman, and having her just, she presents as a very ordinary woman who does extraordinary things. And so that was kind of my overarching favorite part of the entire documentary, which I think was, it was just kind of that entire dynamic really struck me. And I really, really liked that about her.
Yeah, I love that too. Just all the very human moments. And even when she would share times that she faced doubt and not knowing what to do next. And I think that was really relatable too, because who in those situations would say, I absolutely know the one right thing that I'm supposed to do. But the kind of continuous courage to ask herself the question and to try anyway, I thought it was very admirable. And that's speaking to an ordinary woman doing extraordinary things. Yeah. Allison, what about you? What was your favorite part?
Okay, my favorite part also was just the stuffed animals. Like just seeing her always like cuddled up with like her, it just felt like she had so many bears. And I feel like, I'm an adult and I also have stuffed animals and I also love them. So it just felt really relatable to just see her always just like so happy, cuddled up with her stuffed animals. I really love that.
Today. And please go back and check out the panel with the director as well. Feel free to send questions our way at sttp@rfkhumanrights.org. We're happy to answer any other questions that you might have, and we look forward to seeing you at our next speaker series event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.